So now, there are a few other structures that are also important at this point. So not so much when we're lower down, but when we're up high. So these big round things that I've got here, this is the hypoglossal nucleus. As I'm sure you can tell from the name, it is closely involved with the function of the hypoglossal nerve. And in a lower layer, you can see it just about here. Then laterally to it, we'll have another nucleus, which is called the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. It's over here, but at this level, it's a bit smaller. Okay, and even more laterally to it, we have something called the solitary nucleus, which goes here, but then at this point. So what I'm colouring in orange is a solitary tract. And then in the centre, which comes in at the level of the open medulla, you'll have the nucleus. And this is involved in chemoreception. So that's involved with taste and baroreception in your carotids and your aorta. Okay, so there's some of your cranial nerve nuclei. Another important structure that we need to look at is the spinothalamic tract. So we've already looked at the corticospinal tract, but the spinothalamic tract, which is really important in transmitting pain and temperature information, is located down here. And then you'll notice, particularly as we progress to higher levels of the brainstem, which we'll go through in subsequent videos, it'll continue changing position. So while it's down at this point in the pyramidal decussation, when we get to the closed medulla at the point of the sensory decussation, it sort of becomes like this. And then if you move even higher, it sort of stays in the same position, but it's like that. Okay? And likewise, you've got these other tracts called the ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar tracts, which, as the name suggests, transmit information between the spine and the cerebellum. So this one's the ventral spinocerebellar tract. And that sort of stays in roughly the same position, but once again, it keeps moving as other structures move. So this is the VSCT. And then the dorsal spinocerebellar tract is about here. And it's still there at this point, but suddenly at the level of the open medulla, it's gone. Because what substitutes it is this big structure here. And this big structure that we've got here is the beginning of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And that's connecting the medulla to the cerebellum. Okay. Another structure that's important, we've got another structure related to the Q8 nucleus here. And that sort of starts emerging at this point here, and that's just called the lateral Q8 nucleus. But it's very closely related. It's just more information about the arm. And that sort of changes once again. And there's another structure up here which only starts when we get to the level of the open medulla. That's towards the midline. That structure is called the medial longitudinal fasciculus. And what that is for is mediating movements of the head with the eyes. In between that, now you don't see the medial longitudinal fasciculus in the sensory decussation, but as we move up, it suddenly appears. In the middle of those two, we've got this tract called the tectospinal tract, just up here. And that, we don't really know what it's for as of yet, but it may be involved with coordination of head movements. And so you've got those, and at the Another structure that we need to look at is something called the Nucleus Ambiguus, which doesn't really start at the pyramidal decussation, but it starts about here in the sensory decussation. And that's quite closely involved with cranial nerves as well. There is a structure much higher above in the midbrain called the red nucleus. And there's a tract called the rubrospinal tract, which connects the red nucleus to the spine, and basically that's involved in fine coordination of your hands and fingers. So that's where it begins, and it sort of stays in roughly the same spot, right near the spinothalamic tract. Just above there, rubrospinal tract. And in your lower spinal cord, lower medulla, here you have your vestibulo spinal tract, and that's involved with posture. So that sort of, actually that was a mistake, but that sort of moves there, and then it sort of disappears once we get to the open medulla. Other structures that we need to remember that we've got in the center of this particular image here, which I'm going to color in red so that it stands out. The center here, and just towards the center here, just where the decussation is, that's where the central canal is. So the central canal being that middle hole inside your spinal cord and going through your medulla, and that transforms into your ventricular system as it moves through the brainstem and the rest of your brain. It contains cerebrospinal fluid. And then at this point, as we already mentioned earlier, that's where the fourth ventricle is. And here you can actually see some choroid plexus, which is one of the structures that produces CSF. One last structure. At the level of the open medulla, we start seeing some nuclei here. What those nuclei are, and I'm not going to subdivide them into their respective places because that's going to make things a bit too complicated, but this is one of your vestibular nuclei. I think that is all. I hope that wasn't too confusing, and I hope that was helpful. In our subsequent videos, we're going to be looking at other slices of the brainstem. So the next one will be through the pons, and the one after that will be through the midbrain.